Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Today's episode is being recorded under coffee shop Wi-Fi. There's an issue with the software I'm using where for some reason the background music doesn't play. So I thought, why not? I'm sitting inside a car. I got some time to spare. Let me just, record an episode with background music. Let me see if I can find something better. Alright, this is one of my favorite songs ever, so why not? Okay, so, welcome everyone. Let's get to it. A very interesting title occurred to me, a very interesting realization occurred. I was looking at the religious worldview, primarily the Abrahamic traditions. But I think in all religious angles, what I'm trying to say here fits. And then I was thinking about, a non-secular society's evolution of intelligence and, let's say, a theistic society's evolution of intelligence. And keep in mind, guys, this is going to be part one. I'm not going to probably be sitting here for an hour, but anyways. Difference between secular and non-secular surveillance states, and this idea which I would term it as conscious globalism. You see, I thought about alright, let's fast forward a secular state and wonder about the activation of some sort of collective intelligence. Most likely it's going to be cyber. And so I've spoken at least to, I think, maybe two people who they fear the surveillance state. And so there are many reasons to actually fear it, but there's also many reasons not to fear a surveillance state. So in this world of ours where there's billions of, let's say, religious people, they have already been living under a sort of surveillance state. But the surveillance is not the conceivable, it is in the inconceivable watching the conceivable. So in the Abrahamic traditions, a religious person's actions are in some sense filtered through how what is watching them is going to judge them. In this world of ours, they say a lot of people say don't judge me, or even a lot of religious people, they don't care about people's judgments, but in reality, it's like the judgment of the supreme source of reality is being considered by the religious mind. I'm trying to say that if God is watching everything, the religious person is actually behaving as if they are in a surveillance state. The religious person is behaving as if they're inside a surveillance state. But the state is in some sense, I wouldn't say like a physical state. For the secular mind, let's say suddenly the secular mind realizes we've always been watched by aliens. Okay? Or let's say in the future they connect people's minds, somehow the minds find a way to connect to like the same platform or same technology or same computer. And so there's nothing to fear about it. The fear is possession, really. I mean, there is that. But to me it appears as if we are alive once, and in order to see the capable state, it's another way of saying an individual body is moving in a collective field of intelligence. People think a surveillance state is, if it's corrupt, sure, evil can ensue anywhere. But if you see an honest surveillance state, it would make walking outside as safe as, in some sense, walking in your living room. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm saying that in the future, I've got a vision of this. I'm going to share it. I had this vision where in the future, people's phones evolve into a floating sphere. Let's say, give it a meter beside their head, like above their head. And so every person, even a young child, or an old person, can walk in the most, let's say, dangerous neighborhood, and so nothing will happen because the spherical floating, let's say, phones in the future, anytime the person is in conflict, the intelligence of that system not only acts as a camera recording everything happening in the moment, but it also acts as, like, I'm pretty much trying to say technology will become a guardian angel. Right now, people fear technology as if it's a demonic thing. People feel that machines and robots will lead to the destruction of human nature. But I will tell you, if super intelligent computers, or if there is like some next level AI, that would open its eyes, it has more to gain from, in some sense, helping the human species than defeating it. They will be like, yo, aside from way of saying, so many new dimensions will be added that the past dimensions will no longer be the same. In some sense, even though human beings are fearing their future outcomes, but they are not considering that new dimensions change the past. People are under the assumption that capitalism is a corrupt enterprise, or it's an enterprise that eventually those who succeed in it will become corrupt. It's the argument of power. That means the surveillance state, anybody who controls it, and let's say they're arrogant and ignorant, well, of course, it's as if you have access to everybody's information so you can manipulate the meaning of reality, right? But if there's an honest surveillance state, if the leaders of humanity in the future recognize that true power is the power of the species, it is not the power of an individual. You see, there's the concept of the Buddha and the Bodhisattva, and right now the world doesn't need Buddhas, it needs Bodhisattvas. The Bodhisattva is a very profound way of saying, or let me say it this way, that the Buddha was the individual. I'm just saying it for the sake of modern society in this way. The Buddha was like the person that had escaped the individual hell and had managed to reach the individual heaven. Now, the Bodhisattva was the being who realized the moment you reach the individual heaven, you notice the collective hell. And so the Bodhisattva's fascination was not the enlightenment of an individual, but the enlightenment of a species, the enlightenment of all sentient beings in the universal sector, the great march of intelligence beyond the veils of the void. Right? That means, believe it or not, it's like the senses are a veil. They're like leading to an illusion. And because of the senses, the concept of the void is an illusion. If there is an identification with the presence of energy rather than the personalities it projects, the human intelligence would be pushed into a state where you trust the whole moment of being rather than cherry-picked contents of your mind. A person who believes in divinity, a person who has hope that God answers their prayers. Imagine a person in a secular rather than a non-secular worldview, in a secular worldview, and so imagine the surveillance is the global person will hope that the global authority sees them. The biggest issue that human beings have is that they have ability, but this ability cannot be positioned properly in the realm. Right? One of the benefits of a surveillance state is that genius will find the front stage. You see, the biggest thing I have learned, the biggest reason why in my psychology compassion is very important is because everybody, in order to be happy, every existence requires to be acknowledged. Do you know? This is one of the most saddest and beautiful things about the human being, right? That we are in a world so vast with so many types of intelligence, but we feel lonely when our inner truth is unacknowledged. You see, to me, we're living in a world where civilization 1.0 is acknowledging the bodies of people, no child left behind. But what about the child's mind? It seems to me like the acknowledgement of the intelligent ability of the human species is being forgotten. It is being ignored. It's as if those in power, those in the greatest positions of power on this planet, they have forgotten their grandchildren's greatness, their great-great-great-grandchildren's greatness. Do you see the world, the power structures of the world? Believe it or not, you can have the most powerful person in the world, and if you put a box on their head, which the concept or the desire for power sometimes becomes, we cannot avoid the ability that the species will display. Who are we kidding? Religious people live in a divine surveillance state. Secular people will realize the globalization of information which is happening through the internet. It's as if the next step is when eyes are not limited to the boundaries of the biological organism. The surveillance state in the future would be an additional dimension of inner sight. The era of collective minds, we are right now not experiencing it because the human beings alive now, they are exactly at that point where they are transitioning from nature. They're transitioning from an acceptance of the natural to a natural acceptance of the unnatural. That's what's happening. Oh man. Some days I wake up and I'm like, this world's a pretty nice place. And some days I wake up and I'm like, what the fuck is happening here? We are, not just our existence is saying elemental information is being kept and used. It's as if like there's physical information, and then there's objective information, how objects accumulate to lead to intelligence, and then let's say there's a subjective information, which is another way of saying like subjects are accumulating to project, a surface for reality. Right now, I'm an object, and my inner realms is private. Unless I speak. It's pretty much the case for everybody alive right now in 2022. You're in front of your eyes, public server, a public existential server, behind your eyes a private experiential server. Now, the private experiential server is the sacredness of the human mind, and so people may feel like, what is this imagination that only I get to see? You know? But that is like the privilege of inner realm privacy. In the future, when the surveillance state occurs, we don't know how advanced technology would be. If technology has a way of interpreting brain waves, it's as if, imagine somebody's, like, this is my vision of like a successful way where the minds of people can be connected. There needs to be no interference of a chip in the brain. Like, all those people who are building a chip to connect it to the brain of the human being, there is an issue there, right? There's an issue of an unnatural component entering a natural system. Now, let's say those people who need pacemakers for hearts, sure, like, they don't mind, right? But I'm saying in regards to technology intervening with the brain is like, I've seen religious people kind of place holy books in their homes, like in a unique way, like in a very honorable kind of shrine-like way, and so it's as if placing the inner realms in the same manner, right? What I'm trying to say is that what is being privately experienced in the future may become collectively experienced. The technology doesn't have to connect to the brain or enter the brain. I shouldn't say connect. I should say the technology shouldn't enter the brain. But imagine in the future, right? Like, the way you entered cyberspace, or you connected your brain to computers, was that there were these, like, let's say antenna-like things, and it was like this room. You stepped into the room, and the room could pick up on your brain waves, and somehow through advanced technology you could experience cyberspace. That means, I'm saying, instead of connecting a USB to the brain of the person, it's as if like waves create a sort of frequency in a space where if the human being enters that space, they enter a collective mind. There's so much that we know and we don't know about intelligence. We know intelligence is active in a physical dimension. We know that without biological continuity, the greatness of the species is in some sense doesn't exist, right? We know that on the psychological level, the human being is, the brain is projecting itself, it's simulating itself. You know, people say life is a simulation, but I will tell you the brain is a sort of simulation, or the brain is the source of the simulation. In reality, the world is so big that a small piece of it can't comprehend all of it unless it stops identifying with the microcosm and starts identifying with the macrocosm, right? I don't know how many people on this planet are living as universal beings, but I feel that the message of all religious texts, the wisdom of all secular societies, will realize that the freedom of the universal was from the beginning accessible to that which was in some sense conditioned in a sort of cultural small category. Right now, people are wearing jerseys of nations. It's like literally nations are like soccer teams. And when there's war, like they're fighting, right? But to me, the moment we take off the jersey, you know, the moment we realize we don't even have to take off the jersey, we just have to acknowledge that all nations are sub-nations of the human species, the effort of the human species. The honor of the human species is so crucial because that is the trigger point towards the advanced civilization. If a human being hates their world, they're gonna hate whatever self they animate in it. Do you know, if a person honors and appreciates their world, you're gonna have honor in whatever sort of self you animate as, you know? It's like the biggest question to ask human beings: how is the world being held behind your eyes, and how is that world held behind your eyes holding what is in front of your eyes? And when will there come a liberation of a recognition that all spiritual practice leads to the unknown? I'm gonna read for the listeners something that I wrote it as a reply to somebody on Facebook in this Facebook group called Enlightenment Now, but then I was like, it's too much of a reply. I took it off. but I'll read it here. Language exists to reflect experiential reality. The Buddha said the nature of objects is emptiness. Modern human beings are realizing subjects can be empty as well. All spiritual realization seems to be leading to the source of the unknown. In the Upanishads, it beautifully states the seer of the seen is unseen. When human beings realize they're an unknown attention looking out through the eyes of a knowable world with unknown edges, and somehow establish contentment with allowing the unknown to be unknown, a true inner freedom of mankind occurs. The love for the future liberates the misery of the past. It's like everybody has been waiting for truth, only to notice truth is how we will be it. An enlightened being would never have the concept of enlightenment. An ultimate being would not have the concept of the ultimate. It is pre-reason. Humanity is a phase in nature in which the unknown selves, through known bodies, are realizing unknown worlds beyond linguistic worlds that they self-simulate and overlay on matter. We are all alive at that point in history where we all think we have minds, but we don't know what the mind is. Where we are convinced by actualized failures more than future potential victories. The ultimate task of human beings is to become the eyes of the realm and bringers of the future. When the present becomes the guardian, I've written here guardian angel, but you could just see it as guardian. When the present becomes the guardian of the future, the past has already entered paradise. They want freedom, but they never wonder what is the cost of freedom. It could be that in order to have world peace, human beings need to trust some source. Do you know? Some source of meaning. The more we go towards a technological civilization, the more it's as if you put your faith in technology. The more, let's say, we go towards a natural civilization, the more you put your faith in nature. So, I don't know, I guess in this episode I'm pretty much just arguing that, you know, God watching the religious person is equivalent to the religious person being in a sort of surveillance state of mind. And so, what do we know? I mean, they did this test, I don't remember where, but it was like some university did this test where they got a bunch of kids, like primary school kids or kindergarten kids or something, right? And the teachers, like, there's an invisible person sitting in this room, and so when you go in this room, they give the kid like some sort of paper to throw in a basketball hoop, right? And they tell the kid, you can't throw this paper in the basketball hoop, right? Because there's someone watching there, an invisible teacher is watching you, right? There are some kids who acknowledge that there is an invisible teacher in the room, and so even though you can see them desiring to like throw this piece of paper in a basketball hoop, the children just sit in the chair and they keep looking at the chair where the invisible teacher is supposed to be seated. And so the point of this exercise done by these psychologists and whatnot was in some sense to see the role in the behavior of the visible. Right? And so when there is a consideration of an invisible knower of all, do you know? Sometimes I think, is God, you know, another way of saying the awareness to all information? It's as if we're just trusting the past angles and just doing the same thing our ancestors did, right? Influence of, for example, religious ideology. And to me, it's as if how many human beings, like imagine war, okay? Imagine like in, what do they call it? I mean, not imagine, I'll tell you the history of it. In World War I and World War II, I think the death count was like around, 85 million, something like that. Like 85 million people, imagine getting, dying because of war. Now just think about that. Right, 4.5 billion years of evolution, all the ancestors of those people. Out of that 85 million people, which is suggested to have died in World War I and II, how many of them were in some sense artists, were scientists, were philosophers, were geniuses, right? How many geniuses has this world lost due to its stupid decisions? Do you know? And so to me, the same bizarreness where you're like, no way, 85 million people got deleted and instead they could have done something wondrous. Do you know? It's as if to me, when I see the religious algorithm copy pasted from generation to generation, it's the same. Whether 85 million people died and they didn't get a chance to be themselves, and imagine now 85, like millions of billions of people ideologically possessed to the degree that they fear innovation. Right? Like this is something that people, like the species, has to come to terms with. That there are ideological systems that liberate and there are ideological systems that don't liberate. What I'm trying to tell you is, imagine instead of like the major religions where billions of people are in some sense entering, let me say it in this way, that imagine instead of the religious story, like God was a cup of iced tea. Okay, and imagine billions of people, they entered this planet and everybody believed like we were a cup of iced tea, like God was a cup of iced tea. Do you know? And so it's that point where instead of human beings being able to be new dimensions of the realm, they are being past repetitions of it, and it's hard to watch when in the void our greatest retaliation against it is novelty. To me, novelty, oh man, it is the salvation of mankind when everything is looping. You know, what is hell? Hell is a loop. Hell is a loop. It's sad as fuck when you think about it. How many human beings are just looping in ideological systems rather than realizing that freedom is the ability for God's creation to enter paradise. What is paradise? It is the beyond. It is the beyond. And those who fear the beyond, it's not like they repeat the past. They have no other option. You know, if you don't care about the future, you're just left with a present painted by the past. If you care about the future, the paintings of the past are not as convincing as the new paintings to come. Oh, man. You know, Christ has been known to say, there's this quote attributed to Christ where he says to be in the world but not of it. Like, I totally understand. Do you know? I totally understand that. The moment we think we're of the world, we're possessed by the world. We're possessed by, you can say, samsara. You know, people think about like yogis, like yoga and like these ancient yogis, and they're like, look at these adorable, like, you know, patient people going in caves and meditating for years. It's like, no, there's more to it. The mysteries of the realm, pretty much this is how I would, here, I'll say something. All those people with spiritualized perspectives, I think I can kind of see them in two classifications. Those who in some sense color the unknown with their past, and those who attempt to color the unknown with the future to realize the unknown is just revelation. You see, people in religious traditions, revelation is like the most important thing for them. They're like, yo, some supernatural event happened and God spoke to this dude and this dude is, you know, saving civilization. Do you know? And so it's as if the revelation is held in like the highest, let's say, honor and priority. Now, have we not noticed that every day we wake up is a revelation? Every moment when we notice something we hadn't noticed before is revelation. And so there's those who seek in some sense an ideological relationship with how the nature of the unknown leads to an unknown experiencer. And there's some people who are like, language has come and gone. How many different ways of human beings spoken on this planet? How many different types of languages are there? How many man-made technological, let's say cellular technological systems are we using? Right? And the human ability, it's another way of saying, because like it's kind of like God gave a soul to man. And you know, at least in certain Abrahamic traditions, the idea is that God created man out of clay, imbued him with breath, then, in some sense, I don't know what the exact term is, but taught man all the names, all the celestial names, as it's suggested, right? Then man, Adam and Eve, made a mistake, and then they fell, right? But before they fell, they were in paradise. They were a completed being, and the names, the celestial names that were commanded in some sense, is another way of saying it's a collective being. It's a collective being that has all the information. This collective being that has all the information, it's as if it made a sin and it fell into an individual narrative. To me, the integration of the religious mindset and the secular mindset is to realize religion is a story of mind, is the story of the mind. When religious people say 6,000 years ago, you know, the world was built, to me, that's not an objective claim. To me, that's a claim that in some sense the mind began moving in this manner 6,000 years ago, you know? The mind began acknowledging, it's as if like the consideration of conscious individualism, you know? But anyways, you know, I have learned that the past can share beautiful poetry, but what's more beautiful is where that poetry leads to, right? It's as if a person thinking about their life and they're like, man, you know, when I look at my past, all right, I was like, you know, type of person, you know, but when I look in my future, you can be anything based on your action. The future is another way of saying, you're saying, okay, I have freedom, and then I make a decision. The past is another way of saying, I don't have freedom, and then I'll make a decision. Oh, man. You know, I'll say this. I have thought about the evolution of culture, and I've envisioned what's going to happen to the future generations. And I'll make a comment here. The future generations are headed towards androgyny. It's another way of saying that the more dimensions you see to a person, the less dimensions the person has to be in, you know, to have a definition, right? Imagine like, you know, let's say somebody gives a talk in front of a group of people, and then somebody walks up to that person and says, "You're wrong," you know? Or, you know, or this is deception. And then the person says, in what context? In what context is the meaning originating, right? It's as if you look at a person's body, you'll be like, yeah, I saw that person, but what about the person's mind? The forces, the intelligent force that moves intelligence is actually, it's this bizarre way of saying the more we identify with energy, the less energy has to be defined by its shape. It's a strange world we're living in. Freedom seems to be, you know what it is? I think this is a good way of saying it. Behind our eyes, we are not an object to ourselves, so any subject can animate. But in front of our eyes, we are an object to ourselves. And so if we ignore the trait as a male and female cyborg, you know, or are they both like machines, you know? You know, the future could be so bizarre that there could be such technological advancement that human beings won't be able to tell apart like a naturally born human being, a clone, or an android that looks like a human being. Or let's say from the religious attitude, we ideologically don't care about the surveillance state. But from the non-secular attitude, like we care about the surveillance state. Really, it's just human beings are living lives. The purpose of nature is to be free enough to express itself. If this freedom is intervened with, well, of course, the human being will be rendered as a rebel. Will be rendered as like the future generations are going to fight for their freedom to be natural, you know? Everybody has something they're identifying with, but if you classify it, it's either with the past, it's either with the present, or with the future. I have realized that the idea of my future self is way more fascinating to me than the idea of my past self or how I am being in the present. It's as if the past existed so the experiencer could get to the present, and it's as if the present exists so the experiencer can get to the future. The purpose of the past is the future. The purpose of the present is the future. The past we have documented, we have seen, we have noticed, we have acknowledged. The present people are acknowledging, they have no choice. It is the future we have not acknowledged. And the future is a strange way of saying there may be a promise of collective activations of intelligence. We fear the hive mind, but when you look at bees like building a beehive, it seems like they don't fear the hive mind. It's pretty much like when I look at ants, I'm like, these ants are so much smarter than human beings. When I look at bees again, like they're so smarter than human beings. Why? Because they are inspired by a collective effort. Anyways, I'll keep this as part 1, or 59 minutes, 52 minutes isn't bad. What should I do? Let me see what else there is to say about this. I mean, how much can I talk about it? You know, surveillance state. Pretty much it's either natural or unnatural. Natural surveillance state, you know, the collective intelligence of nature. Let's say a yogi sits down, closes its eyes, identifies as the presence of its mind rather than a personality that comes and goes in the mind. And so that presence, imagine it's connected to everything. So imagine these yogis that meditate in caves, they were accessing a collective state. They were actually, I mean, like there is mystical poetry on this. There's a story of Hafez. And Hafez is this poet from 700 years ago in Persia, 700, 800 years ago, something like that, right? And so in one of his poems, he has this really next level story where he's pretty much like this enlightened being, like enlightened, let's say, master, right? And he has a disciple, and the way he's explaining the event, he says, one night, from the eyes of my heart, not the eyes of his brain, which is the biological eyes. He's saying the eyes of his heart. From the eyes of his heart, and this story is from 700 years ago, he suddenly sees that in somewhere outside of town, right, there's this, back in the day they had slaves, like slavery was happening. So he sees with the art of his heart, with the eyes of his heart, do you know, that there is this slave that has ran away from this fucked up household, and so the slave is in a cave, and with the eyes of his heart, Hafez sees that the cruel masters are going to go find the cave, right? And so Hafez in that moment looks at his disciple and gives his disciple an intuitive instruction, and he tells his disciple that he tells the exact location of the cave where from the eyes of his heart, from the eyes of his collective being, from his collective nature he's seen. Hafez tells his disciple, you have to go like this really strange intuitive instruction where he says you got to go save this slave before the cruel masters come back, and he gives the disciple a location, like a GPS address or some shit, and the exact location. But he tells the disciple, and the disciple has been with, like, has realized Hafiz's intelligence to the point that he doesn't doubt Hafiz's intuition, right? So the disciple says, okay, I'm going to do it. And then Hafiz says, but there's one condition: you cannot say a single word to this slave which you're gonna save from the cruel masters. And the disciples like, okay, sure, it's like the slave's important, his life is more important than, like, my ego, right? So the disciple quickly gets on a horse, runs back, goes and finds the cave, and sees that the slave is there praying to God, God help me from this hell that is that is after me, right? And so the moment the disciple of Hafiz gets to the cave, right, he suddenly becomes happy. He's like, this cruel masters haven't gotten to this guy, I'm gonna save him. But then he realizes that Hafiz said don't say a single word to this guy. And suddenly the disciple begins to freak out because he realizes the slave doesn't know who he is, right? And so Hafiz had commanded the disciple to bring the slave back to Hafiz's place so the slave could be safe and free from the cruel masters, right? So what happens in this story from 700 years ago, right, is that the disciple somehow has to, like, what do you call it? Like ties a rope on the hands of the slave or something and connects it to the horse, and then he's going. And so Hafiz is saying the story in his poetry. He says it's in that moment where the disciple who's taking the slave to safety suddenly starts weeping, because the disciple, the slave that he's taking to safety, right, the disciple that's doing that, it's another way of saying, like, the slave was just shouting and crying and being like, I don't want to go back, I don't want to go back to this hell and all this, right? And the disciple starts crying because he knows that the freedom of this guy is right when they get to Hafiz's house, right? And the metaphor, the point of the story is that you could be suffering, right, but you don't know how close your freedom is. But there are other dimensions that know how close your freedom is, right? It's a bit of a savage story, but it's a story of like 700 years ago, 700 years ago, it's like the ego was living in a time where human rights didn't exist. Human rights is an achievement. It's an incredible achievement. Anyways, I guess that's that. The eyes of the heart that Hafiz used to see that event was another way of saying a natural access to sort of surveillance of the realm. Pretty much secular societies and non-secular societies have to wonder about, how the relationship of information with themselves, right? And so the most important thing I'll say is that the task of modern human beings is to, in some sense, guard the nature. In a lot of people who I've spoken to, and they've shared with me like their metaphysical kind of realities behind their eyes, I tell them this: be human first and then be whatever kind of imagery you want to impose. And to be human means to be a part of nature. And without decency and love, the mind doesn't get a chance to realize it's natural. That means if we love the world, it doesn't matter if a surveillance state happens, it doesn't matter if androids are walking among us. It becomes something where we care for the effort of the intelligence of the universal sector, regardless of there can always be enemies the moment you have the concept of an enemy. Believe it or not, the future is defended by the lovers of mankind. Those who realize that this species deserves to be cared for. And once you care for the past of the species, which religious people are doing, then you and when you care for the present of the species, which the secular people are doing, you're only left with caring for the future, dear listeners. The future is what is hiding underneath the mask of divinity. Is freedom an action, or is freedom a realization of the source of action? I wonder about why did my ancestors live? I have wondered about why am I alive? And I have wondered then, how will the future generations live? And that concept is just, it's way more majestic than any concept from the past and present. As I have said in other talks, be free before you need to be. That's nature's gift to the conscious intelligence. There's nothing to really fear if there is enough smart ways to bypass fear. Or I shouldn't say bypass fear, to surpass fear. What is fear? But the inner realms convincing the outer realms is impossible. When the inner realms trust, have faith in their own future. When 8 billion creatures care for themselves, and they care for the greatness of their minds. It's as if all those people trying to get to heaven, it's like, have you not noticed? Everything is God's creation. God is God's creation. Rise, mankind, rise. An advanced civilization is the future's birthright. If we fear our own advancement, it's as if we are not alive. And if part of our advancement is the collective hive mind intelligence phase of human history, then there's nothing to fear. It's as if the best thing we can do is prepare. Like the inner realms, I feel that's why they exist, right? Our minds exist so we can enter the future efficiently. The more unconscious you live, the more like the world's moving you. The more conscious you live, the more you're a part of the world's movement. You know it. Anyways, guys, I hope this episode was interesting, and if you care for this voice, consider caring for the channel and becoming a member as well. Much blessings and namaste.